Hello, how are you doing? Welcome to The Brave Front, a brand new podcast with a single purpose, to talk about men's mental health. My name's Tim Bainan, and although I'm not a doctor, psychologist or academic, I've been fascinated by the subject of men's mental health for years. Also, while I might be lacking on the PhD front, I do know how it feels to have to put on a brave front. Back in 2017, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, aged 40, and although thankfully it was caught early and treated to the extent that I am now cancer-free today, it challenged my own mental well-being profoundly. So the legacy left by my cancer has been a deeper appreciation and understanding of the mental health challenges faced by men today, often inwardly and silently. I also work for a charity that supports others affected by poor mental health. So over the years, I've seen firsthand, both personally and professionally, how men's mental health has slowly risen up the news agenda, with mental health awareness days and weeks helping to raise awareness and to get men talking. And that's great, but sadly, I've also seen how once the awareness days are over, the coverage and conversations inevitably dry up. So in an effort to keep them going, to ensure we talk about men's mental health around the clock, I thought I'd start this little podcast. And through it, I'd like to talk to men and women across the country who have far more compelling stories to tell and advice to give than me. Men and women who are experts in their fields, who have come through adversity, who have faced challenges to their mental health, who have fought through the darkest of times, and who now want to help others to do the same. As well as the serious stuff, I also want to look at mental health from all angles, including how every man on the planet can boost his mental well-being each day, how exercise and nutrition can help, what books, films and TV can inspire us, how we can take the stress out of parenting, work and relationships, how we can overcome everyday fears, what time outdoors and Mother Nature can teach us, and even why technology can work both for and against our mental well-being. Indeed, there's so much for us all to talk about when it comes to men's mental health. And by sharing the real-life stories of men who have lived experience of poor mental health, as well as exploring the topic from every angle with experts and academics who work tirelessly to better understand mental health, I want the Brave Front to be a place that men can turn to when they want to better understand themselves and be inspired by others. And to kick things off, this episode's guest, Alex Staniforth, is the very embodiment of inspiration. At just 28, he has led a life worthy of a movie, and today, as a motivational speaker, author, endurance athlete and charity founder with a passion for the outdoors, he makes a living inspiring others and helping them to overcome the kind of mental health burdens that he has carried on his shoulders for most of his young life. From my perspective, I've always loved reading about people who take on incredible challenges, and Alex has not only done that, twice attempting Mount Everest amongst other things, but he has also escaped death, suffered physical and mental setbacks, and learned to overcome personal adversity from childhood into his adult life. I won't give too much away, as it all sounds so much better in Alex's own words, but what I will say is if the only thing you take from this interview is the fact that Alex has founded the charity Mind Over Mountains, I urge you to go and check it out to see what incredible work it is doing today and what it could potentially do for you. From the safe surrounds of the Cheshire countryside to the unforgiving slopes of Mount Everest, after listening to Alex's story, I also urge you to think about what your next challenge is going to be. Alex, great to see you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. Really grateful for you giving us your time today. How are you? How's things?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Good to be here as well, and thank you for your time as well and sharing these stories. Yeah, I mean, it's a classic thing of, how are you? I'm fine, when there's lots of stuff going on. And one thing I often say instead is, how are you out of 10? We've started using that ourselves in charity recently, which I think is a really good metric to find out where we are really. I'd say I'm probably a 6 out of 10 at the moment. I sprained my ankle last weekend, so I'm now not able to run for a short while, which is very frustrating. But aside from that, there's a good balance at the moment, and I'm hopefully going to get out for a swim this afternoon, which will help as well.
Excellent. I know as a runner, I know how frustrating it is when you pick up a niggle or you roll an ankle or something like that. And you think, that's 2 or 3 weeks out. I know how frustrating that is. So I feel your pain on that front. Where can we find you today? I can see on the call you were at home. Is an interesting. It looks like it's almost like a sort of snapshot into your life. Is that a 2012 baton behind you? I see.
The Olympic torch is behind me. I mean, I obviously had to have that on show. I was fortunate in 2012. I was chosen as I was chosen as a torchbearer, and we all got to keep our torch. So that's now on display. There's a telescope which I got off my grandma, which I've not worked out how to use yet, but it kind of makes you look like kind of adventurer or explorer-esque. So that's there as well. And then various books and outdoor stuff. But I'm in Kendal, so I'm just on the edge of the Lake District. I'm not from here. I'm still a tourist officially. I was born in Chester, and I've been here in the lakes for nearly 4.5 years now, I guess, just for that outdoor lifestyle.
Wow. And knowing a little bit about your story as I do, obviously, what a place to live, the Lake District. Being someone who loves the outdoors and the mountains, I can't think of anywhere better to be. It must be fantastic.
It's great. I mean, it's not great when you're self-employed and the weather's good. You don't get a lot of work done, but it's my happy place, and it's where my journey began in terms of the outdoors. It's where I really found myself, and it's now what I call home for sure. It's when the conditions are good, it's magical. And I was lucky to move here before the pandemic. So being here during the pandemic was obviously a very different experience. I can't see myself being anywhere else because there's just an overwhelming amount of choice. It's almost stressful when the weather's nice because you don't know where to go and what to do.
Too much choice.
Too much choice is stressful, yeah.
So if anyone who might not be familiar with your story, how would you, if you can give us a potted history, a 1-sentence summary of your story, what would that sentence be?
I do silly challenges. I guess I describe myself as an adventurer, endurance athlete, motivational speaker, author, and the founder of a mental health charity. And my journey really is about challenging myself and inspiring other people, and sharing my story, my challenges close to home as well. And helping people to, achieve their potential regardless of their challenges in life. I'm 28, so I'm still fairly young. I'm trying to cling on to that as long as I can and keep the momentum going. But that's the best way to describe myself really is my life is underpinned by challenges and I overcoming them.
An amazing, just a short summary there. You've listed a few things that one of those would be enough for most people, but incredible. And you snuck in there founding a charity. I mean, that in itself is an incredible achievement. I want to talk more about that a little bit later on. But before we do, as you say, you're only 28. You're still so young, and you've been through so much, and you've seen so much. But I want to rewind a little bit and go back to even younger Alex. Back when you were growing up, where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? What are your memories of those years?
Yeah, where did base camp begin? It's kind of a lot more normal. I was very fortunate. I had a kind of what you describe as a normal start in life. I'm an only child, at least until I moved out, and then the dog became the only child. And I was brought up on the outskirts of Chester, and a very rural, green part of the world. Very lucky to live about a mile away from a big forest. So I spent a lot of my childhood walking the dogs with my dad in the forest and being in nature, but nothing extreme, nothing like challenging as such. And it was all pretty comfortable. So I was about 9 years old and I had a mouthful of epilepsy, which was a pretty unsettling thing to go through at such a formative time. That led to anxiety and panic attacks at a young age from just that constant threat of danger. Having a stammer all my life as well, which I've never really known life without that. I've just learned to live with that. That is strange because now I make a living out of motivational speaking, but I guess it's all very much on brand. And badly bullied through school as well because of all these things and because I was different. So when you're different, you become a target. And as runners now ourselves, it might be kind of hard to understand, but I hated sport at school. I hated exercise. I was hopeless. I was really unfit. And now, running is my medication. It's what keeps me in a good place. So that's kind of the snapshot. And before it sounds like a bit of a pity party, that was where I was. And so growing up, there was definitely an element of adventure and nature. Walking the dogs, spending time in the caravan in North Wales, fishing and being out and loving wildlife. But nothing of the likes of what I do now, and challenges. And I guess that came later on. Just to kind of segue into that really, when I was about 14 was when I discovered the outdoors properly. And the outdoors became a vehicle, a way to get out of this very shy, anxious, low confidence self, this existence, and to really find a way to fight back, to improve myself and to prove all the bullies wrong. And that was where I finally found myself.
Sure. And that anxiety and that low confidence, that came from the bullying you experienced at school. And that you said that was down to your having epilepsy and the fear, I suppose, of having an episode at school. And was that what was behind it? And when you look back at that now, how did that make you feel at the time? Can you remember what the emotions were back then?
I mean, it feels like a fairly long time ago, but anxiety is still something I deal with now, and so it's the same kind of process. And you don't become immune to it; you just become better at managing and being aware of it. And I've had panic attacks as recently as this year. But at the time, from what I can recall, it's just this constant sense of danger, and having had a seizure, which is quite a scary thing to go through at a young age. I mean, any age really, when you've got ambulances turning up and you wake up on the floor and you're like, don't know what's happened. It made me very, very health anxious, and naturally you get a trigger. And anxiety, for me, at least, has always been around triggers. You have a bad experience, you have a trauma that then becomes a trigger. And it takes time. It takes time and sometimes therapy and help to be able to kind of unwire those things, and exposure over time. Like speaking, for example, speaking in front of hundreds of people at first was the most terrifying thing. Now I do it for a living and it's totally fine, because of exposure. But it was that fear of something happening. It was the fear of having another seizure. And I often say that having a seizure in McDonald's meant that for many years, just the smell of fast food could trigger a panic attack. I couldn't go for a meal with my parents for years and years. And obviously I'm fine with that now.
It almost sounds like a bit like PTSD in a way. I work for a charity that supports firefighters that work around trauma, and they talk about very similar things. And quite often it's the innocent sounds that they hear in the supermarket, perhaps, or beeps and so on and so forth, that trigger memories that they have from incidents they attended or whatever. So I imagine for you, you mentioned the McDonald's thing. It was a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, at a young age it was, and I'm only really aware of that now with awareness and on hindsight. But there's been other triggers that have now come into my life from various other traumas and events, and they still affect me. And the stammer as well is often kind of anxiety led, because if I have a bad experience with one person, it's almost like it knows. And when I come back to that person, it's like, it kind of seizes up to try and protect itself. And therefore I stammer. And often if you start to look for something, you will find it. And I've been reading a lot recently around kind of confirmation bias. And when I'm in a bad place mentally, there is this kind of confirmation bias where I'm looking for evidence to prove a belief. And it's being aware of that. And then obviously, most of the things we worry about rarely actually happen. That's the irony and the challenge of anxiety. Where it's being aware of that state, and nowadays there's lots of the triggers, and it's just being mindful that they are triggers.
And through the years as you were growing up, where did you turn to for support? Where was your go-to place? You mentioned the outdoors being important to you as well, but obviously I'm assuming your parents were there as a support as well. But were there other avenues of support that you lent on during that time?
I've always been really independent, and so I've often just got off on my own and done things, and that's been my way of coping. Like, although I say I hated sport, I used to kind of enjoy mountain biking around the forest, and I'd go off on my own and for hours and hours and do that. And nature was always a very safe space to be. But with support, I mean, I was very close to my parents, and they obviously went through the whole epilepsy journey as well, so it was really hard for them, for sure. And so they were often there when these things happened, and they were able to talk me through them. But a lot of the anxiety was probably peaking whilst I was at school. And so teachers were very supportive. In certain areas, I really had to help them. I had to get them to help me kind of accommodate that. For example, because of all the hospitals and tests as a young kid, I was very, very health anxious. And even biology at school, I could pass out, or I'd have to go and sit in the corridor before I fainted because I'd get that squeamish. So they had to accommodate that. And as it happens, they ended up doing an A-level in biology. So it was mostly teachers, but I've generally got quite good at dealing with it on my own.
Yeah.
And there was professional support further down the line. That was more for depression as opposed to anxiety. But yeah, I've often just found my own way of dealing with stuff.
Sure. And obviously you mentioned the outdoors being really important to you, and having read a little bit about your past and the sort of milestones in your life. As I understand it, was a holiday when you were 13 and a specific activity you did on that holiday that kind of changed everything for you. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I have to be careful with the chain of events because I often get them kind of muddled up in my own head. But
yeah,
there was a few of those breakthrough moments, but realistically, it was more a case of a chain of them, and then all of a sudden they all make sense together. But I was on holiday in Turkey with my mum because my parents split up when I started high school, so that kind of changed the dynamic a lot as well. And I remember when I was there seeing something, seeing this thing advertised at paragliding. And I'd never, obviously, that was a pretty big leap out of my comfort zone. I'd never done anything like that, let alone jumping off a 7,000-foot mountain. But there was this real curiosity. There was almost this calling. I just knew I had to do this. I wanted to do it. I've always been interested in flying and planes and various things. And so I just had this calling that I had to do this. And
what did your mum think? Yeah. What did your mum think?
Like, mad. She was like, where on earth does that come from? Because I was never really that way minded. Or at least not that I knew I was. And so we decided not to book it until the very night before, because then there's less chance of me pulling out. And I didn't have my breakfast that morning, which for me is a sign something's really not right. I felt that sick with fear, but I did it. And it's just that mindset shift. When you prove yourself wrong, you completely reframe your whole mindset and programming. And then anything, so much more then felt possible because of that. And so I then started challenging myself more and more and more. And then shortly afterwards, I was invited hill walking in the Lake District with my friend Tom. Now, I was still anxious by this point. I still had the anxiety, but I was less restricted by it. I started saying yes a lot more. And it was that hill walk in the Lake District, looking around me at all the fells as a 14-year-old kid, broadened your horizons, and I became obsessed with the outdoors and adventure. And then at some point that day, the idea of climbing Everest popped into my head. Mm-hmm. I went home, I Googled it, and just became fascinated. As the more I read about it, the more obsessed I became. And I just knew that one day that was my life goal. That was the end goal, was to climb Everest. And yeah, I guess the rest was history.
And that's quite an incredible sort of thing to go through, and in terms of that sort of, as I said, that milestone moment and that sort of realization in your mind that this is something that I want to do, comes from putting yourself well outside of your comfort zone, I'm assuming, in terms of doing that paragliding, but something obviously triggered inside you then to think, this adrenaline that I'm experiencing here, this positivity, this outside of my comfort zone is what I want to do. And that's, as you say, was what's driven you going forward. Would that be something that you'd recommend others to give a go?
I mean, we're always being told to, live your dreams and go out your comfort zone and all that stuff. And it becomes a bit of a cliche, but my mantra is often just throw yourself in the deep end and learn to swim. Yeah. And some people wouldn't agree with that approach. And obviously safety is always really important. And just a caveat that after those 4 years, I did take the steps and do the climbing and the training to get myself ready for that and every goal I've set since. Well, people are often waiting for motivation to take action. So I'll do that another time. I'll do that next year. I'll do that then. And they cast it into the future, and then life gets in the way. And for me, it's all about choices and accountability. And once you commit to something, when you set the date, almost when you throw yourself in the deep end, you have to learn to swim to make it happen. And so I would say that we have become we have created a society that is too comfortable. It's going against our psychology. I mean, going against that doesn't feel comfortable. That's why we don't do it. And we don't have to do it often. But I think until we're in that position where we're feeling that fear, we're feeling that discomfort, and we're sitting with that, we're just accepting that's there. We're not going to discover what we're capable of, and whenever I'm looking for a challenge, I'm always looking for that careful balance between like excitement of, oh, can I do that? And fear of, oh my God, what on earth am I thinking? And sometimes I got that really wrong. But I often say that there's only two options, you know, if you either finish it or you learn something.
Yeah.
But obviously it's daunting. So what I would advise people is, if leaping off a mountain, quite literally leaping out of your comfort zone is too much and paralyzes you, the best thing to do is just break it down one small step at a time. And I was having a chat about this earlier on with someone, and, you know, I said when I started running, it was like I entered a 10K. And then you think, oh, I can never do anything more than that. Next thing you're doing a half marathon. Then you're doing a marathon. Then you say never again. And then you're doing a 100-miler. And then you're saying, blimey, never again. And then you probably enter another one. Just take the first step, you know, and commit to it.
And you think you'll be surprised in what you can achieve if you do that.
Absolutely. And that's the exciting part, you know, and when things hurt, when things start to fall off, that's when most people give up, and often they give up before the body has a chance to adapt. But sometimes those circumstances are forced on you, and you have no choice but to learn and to find a way through it. And for me, that's why I think the outdoors is so important for building that resilience in everyday life.
So tell me a bit about Everest. Now, so you're 14, and at 14 you have a dream to climb Everest, and it takes you 4 years to get there. Tell me about those intervening 4 years, the planning, the preparation, your mindsets, and what was driving you to get to Everest and to take on something so huge.
I think initially it was about gathering evidence and trying to learn from other people, you know, reaching out to other young climbers and people. It's like, how do I follow in their footsteps? Just kind of making a plan, really. There was no immediate deadline at that point or urgency. I was running a lot. That was when I discovered running, and that became my kind of goal in the meantime. Everest was like a pipe dream for the future at that point. Mm-hmm. And first sort of big peak was Mont Blanc when I was 17. That was, when I was 16. And that was sort of the first step, but that's still only about half the height of Everest. Then it was climbing Mera Peak and Bruntsea in Nepal, obviously climbing and stuff in the UK and Scotland. But that's only one element. The main element really is probably the fundraising, because as people will know, Everest isn't cheap. And back then, to get a place on a commercial expedition with Tim Mosdale, who was my Everest guide, was realistically, I was looking at about $45,000, and that's just for the trip, let alone the costs of the kit and insurance and all the training as well. Now, I've never really had, I've always had a background where I've had to work hard for things, and Everest has a stereotype. There's a lot of rich people there, which is true, but there's also a lot of people that and my job as a pot washer in a local pub at weekends obviously wasn't going to pay that much money, so I was going to have to find a way or make one. And I realized, having spoken to other climbers, that corporate sponsorship was the only option I really had. So yeah, I mean, at 16, I started that fundraising journey. And what was the catalyst though? What really changed things was I got an injury. I couldn't run or cycle for like nearly the best part of a year, which felt like an eternity. Mm-hmm. And at that age, I've not had to deal with that before. And so that triggered depression, anxiety, and eating disorder. That was when my mental health really kind of emerged. And also was always there. That was the first time I had to deal with any serious problem. And it was being stuck in this like depressed, hopeless, injured state that I actually realized I needed a goal. I needed a new purpose. And if I did Everest in 2014 at 18, that would make me the second youngest Brit and also the youngest to climb from the south side in Nepal. Now, when you're fundraising, you've got to have a hook. You've got to have something like that. And it's probably the least sensible, likely thing you do in that situation, but I just committed. I said, right, in 2014, I'm going to climb Everest. And I remember looking at this picture of Everest on my laptop and just having this goosebumps up my arm. And I just knew that was what I had to do. I just knew it. I just couldn't explain. I just had this decision. I still remember that moment. I didn't get a lot of biology work done that night. And that was it. It was about commitment. But then it's like, how am I going to raise an extra, 35 grand in less than 18 months? So I finished my A-levels. Well, I started sponsorship whilst I was doing my A-levels, but literally that in in a nutshell, that meant a year of sending emails to thousands of companies across the UK with no guarantee of success.
And tell me how your mental health changed in that time when you say, you went through that, you found yourself in that place with anxiety, depression, and an eating disorder as well. How did committing to something as big as Everest and having that goal, what impact did that have on those things and on your mental health as a whole?
From what I remember, it was about hope. It was about creating a purpose. It was about having a reason to get out of bed in the morning, something bigger that I was working towards. And I realized that to achieve those goals, I was going to need to be at 100% capacity. Now, I've always been fortunate that I've always been quite high functioning, so that no matter how bad I feel, I'm often quite good at just getting stuck into something. That's my way of burying it, is being busy. So being busy, having a goal for me was, in hindsight, I was probably just trying to distract myself from it, trying to put it in a box. I had a chance to prove myself to myself and to all the bullies perhaps as well. Mm-hmm. The eating disorder was still there. That was going to be there until I got back to running, and sadly it then carried on more than that and kind of 8 years longer. But I think it's about hope. And I think hope is probably the most important component in that, is having that reason to get out of bed in the morning. And it just ignited this fire, because I've always, when there's a challenge, I'll rise to it. And that was what I needed. Now, I know it's a very, very, very extreme example. And for anybody that maybe might be there right now, I don't want them to think that they need to set a goal that big to get out of it, because after Everest, sometimes my goals were literally just getting out of bed and running 5K. That was my Everest. So it's important that that's not going to work for everybody, but it's about having something to get you out of bed in the morning.
Everything's relative, isn't it? Everyone's individual, but Everest is whatever it is to them. So I totally understand that. But talking about Everest itself, now, it didn't quite go as you'd hoped it would do, did it? That first attempt. Tell us a little bit about how that went.
Not quite. Yeah, not quite. 2014, we got so we spent 3 weeks walking to base camp. It's a 2-month trip, and having got the funds literally about 4 weeks before the trip was due to start, it all came together perfectly. And we were about a day before base camp when there was a massive avalanche in the icefall above base camp, and sadly 16 Sherpas died. So the biggest disaster in Everest history at the time, and everything obviously fell apart. We had to pack up and go home without actually climbing on the mountain at all. Obviously that's irrelevant because we're going home safe to our families. So I didn't really anticipate for that. You think that the harder you work, then the more lucky you'll get. But obviously the mountain doesn't quite work that way, and nor does life. So it was a chance to go home and train harder, come back stronger, do as much as I could possibly control to maximize my chance of success. In 2015, we were back on the mountain in the same team, same format, very similar. And this time it felt like it was really happening. And we were heading up to Camp 1 for the first time. We were just below Camp 1, actually, in the icefall, when the earthquake hit Nepal. And we were literally getting hit by a big blast of powder, thinking for the first time in my life that, at 19, that this is it. To then be stuck at Camp 1 for 2 days, 6,000 meters higher than Kilimanjaro, being hit by avalanches and aftershocks on both sides, and realizing that actually we were a tiny part in this disaster which had taken over 9,000 lives. So yeah, that quite didn't go to plan either.
Tell me about how that made you feel, because obviously you survived 2 near-death experiences trying to achieve your dream, and after the first one that would have been enough for anyone, but you showed your resilience and went back and tried again, and then the earthquake struck. How did that make you feel after that? Did you feel lucky? Did you feel scared? Did you feel more determined than ever to achieve your dreams in life? How did that experience impact you?
I think back to your point before around, PTSD and trauma, that was the initial reaction. Like at 19, I don't think any age you can train for that. And it should really caveat that I was really, really fortunate because, had we not left base camp that morning, we probably wouldn't be having this chat now just by the sheer scale of devastation. And sadly, we lost 3 of our team that morning. And how did it feel? I think initially you go into sort of survival mode and shock. You're just trying to make the best of the situation. It didn't really hit me until I was actually on the flight home. And I remember just breaking down in Doha Airport, because only the people that were there could really understand. Like nobody back home can possibly comprehend what you've been through apart from your teammates. And I used to remember this sense of guilt. I didn't want to be at Everest. I didn't want to be anywhere. The goal was irrelevant. I mean, goals can be replaced. Lives can't. And there was a sense of luck and gratitude, but just guilt. Why them? Why not me? Seeing this beautiful country just devastated and people have lost everything. So that was the initial feeling. I think when I got home, it was really bittersweet because obviously my family were so happy and I knew I was lucky, but you can't really enjoy it. I just felt lost, and I think there was that initial depression and sort of trauma, and that I don't think that's ever gone away. I still, even all these years later, I still think about that, and I think I always will. About what happened that day. But I quickly realised, like the Sherpas, you have to make the best of a bad situation, and I had an obligation to tell this story, to try and help people, to try and get that message out there. I mean, I experienced 2 pretty unique events in 2 years, and I had an obligation to tell that story and try and turn it into something good. So the kind of knee-jerk reaction was just throw myself into fundraising and to speaking, and that inevitably kind of kick-started a speaking career. I wrote my first book after that, which wasn't the book we planned to write, but actually maybe took a different story. And then essentially I just kept very, very busy. The problem was at the end of all that year, that I just burnt out, and you realize you've been running away from stuff and you've got to process it. You've got to process that.
And how did you do that? Is, as you say, you can only put it off for so long. And did that manifest itself in any way in terms of the fact that it caught up with you?
Yes. And I think mental health wise, like I remember having a really bad episode of depression. My eating disorder was the worst it's ever been. That was a coping mechanism, and I think I realized when it had got to the worst point was like I just going to do a talk at a primary school was like overwhelming, and doing a half marathon and just halfway around I just quit. I just stopped my watch and walked home. Now I knew I could do a half marathon, but that was the point when I realized that this was something I couldn't do on my own. As an adventurer and as an athlete, I was supposed to be mentally tough and all these things. And so I think it happened because it all poured out the bucket, and eventually it will do. But after that point, I was able to kind of rebuild myself.
Yeah, and how did you do that? Was there anybody or anywhere you turned to for support at that time?
I went to my GP. I remember just breaking down into tears, and asking for help, and I got referred to that. But in the meantime, I'd started setting more plans and more goals, and then I planned to do an expedition back to the Himalayas and Cho Oyu, which is the 6th highest peak in the world. And that was the only thing I knew was to set myself another challenge. I think it was a case of just letting go of everything, and then with medication, with a few other things, I got myself back into a place where I could help myself.
And also a place where you've come to help other people as well. Tell us a little bit about Mind Over Mountains and how it came about. Well, what the charity is, first of all, what it does, and how you started it, and tell us the backstory of Mind Over Mountains.
So the backstory first with the charity is I've always used the outdoors as my medication, as you've probably gathered. And I'm not saying it's a miracle cure, but I think it's a tool that everybody should have access to. I think if more people used it, we could intervene with a lot of the mental ill health in society. And I'm not saying it's for everybody. Pills have had a role for me, but I think that often that's just an easy response where we can manage it with more natural interventions. So off the back of Cho Oyu, I had this kind of midlife crisis at 21 when I thought, actually, am I really making my biggest impact in life, by climbing big mountains? Am I what would I have left behind had I been on that mountain on Everest the year before? So I set off a challenge around the UK called Climb the UK, climb to the highest point of all the counties in the UK by human power in 72 days. And what struck me from that challenge, although I actually completed it for a change, was it took me longer to get an appointment for my depression and my eating disorder, having had bulimia for sort of 4 years, than it did to cycle, walk and run 5,000 miles around the UK. And that simply wasn't good enough. So an opportunity came from that challenge where I got contacted by a group called Adventure Uncovered who wanted to do an event around mental health and the outdoors. Kind of became an ambassador for that, helped them to kind of design that, and inevitably being a perfectionist took over a little bit and wanted to make it more than just a weekend of walking. So we brought in a coach, Chris, who was my first mentor, counselling, inspirational speakers and mindfulness, and just kind of creating this kind of holistic walk and talk safe space for people to get away and build the tools that they need. We did that first event in the lakes in 2018. Me and Chris were blown away by the impact it had. We decided to do it again the following year. And then we registered as a charity in August 2020. So we've just turned 3 years old. And obviously then the pandemic came along and obviously changed a lot of our plans. So we had to sort of rethink it. But we started doing day walks as well as weekend retreats that still have this combination of walking, mindfulness, and just having that level of professional mental health support. Because it's often a lot easier to talk about things when you're in the open, walking side by side. And now what we do is we work all over England and Wales, day walks and weekend retreats for anybody over 18, both in the public, but also we're doing a lot of work with the blue light services and organisations. People that have dealt with a lot of trauma, just to give them some time for themselves. And I'm a trustee and a founder, so I'm still heavily involved. I often say it's a full-time unpaid job. But it's kind of a legacy that I never really planned to create so young, but there's definitely a demand. And I think what we do is quite unique in the wellbeing space. And, my vision for it is that we are prescribed by the NHS. I think that's where we need to be. But that's, in a nutshell, what we do. And we have a fantastic team of people that really believe that.
And who comes on your retreats and on your walks? Is it open to anybody of any level of fitness, or is it, tell us about who it's aimed at?
Yeah. So we're obviously trying to be more and more inclusive, but inevitably, because of where we're walking or where we are, like, there is a level of fitness and health required. But we do our very best to accommodate people. We've had people who've been, deaf and blind who've been on our events, and they've got so much out of that. Whereas a lot of people would just say, no, you can't come. We do a range of walks from sort of very easy to quite kind of challenging mountain walks, to accommodate different fitness levels. But generally, anybody over 18 that is able to walk for a few hours in the hills. It's not a race. There's no fitness test. Our walks are very slow because we take in mindfulness and surroundings to accommodate that. But through partnerships and organisations, I really hope that we can be even more inclusive. But as such a small charity, we also have to be realistic about what we can do. And there are some brilliant charities that specialise in that. But we have everybody from single parents needing a bit of time out to people that have recently been in hospital because of their mental health, who are using it as part of their recovery, to ex-military, entrepreneurs, people as young as 18 up to 70, 80 plus. It's a really broad range, but we always meet as strangers and come back as friends.
Well, what would you say to those people who love the idea, and there must be many people who do, but for whom maybe the thought of being in a group of people they don't know for a couple of days might be a bit too much for them? What would you say to them?
I mean, that's why we do the day walks, because it's a much easier access point. It's a lot less overwhelming. And having a stammer, I think I'd be nervous turning up in a group. We have like a pre-walk Zoom session as well. So people have a chance to meet each other, which I think really helps the anxiety, people say. And what I'd say is that there is no judgment, there's no expectation, there's no pressure. Everybody says how nervous they are arriving, meeting people, but straight away they feel at home. And the coaches and the counsellors who lead our events, they're very, very good at welcoming people and making them feel comfortable. And I would say is the groups are very small as well, intentionally for that reason. bring a friend, come with somebody else. That makes it easy for you. But everybody says how welcoming it is. And if you're interested, our website, best place to have a look. If you're unsure, send us an email, and we'd love to help.
I wanted to ask you, obviously someone, only 28 and you've led an incredible life, up to this point, achieved a huge amount. And as we've been talking about, how would you describe your relationship with your mental health today? Is it something you've learned to live with, or is it a battle you're still fighting?
I'd say both. I'm always learning. Self-awareness is growing. But perhaps the most disappointing thing I found is that despite all I've learned, I could still find myself in those same low points that I thought I'd never go back to. And it's still a battle, but I think now I've got that experience, that reference point that I've been there before, and that this too will pass, and that, things can go downhill very quickly still. But I don't think I think that any kind of goal of being perfectly free of that, I think I'll let go of that. I think it's accepting that this is part of life, and it depends on what's happening in our lives. But I would say the relationship is still very much a work in progress. And, last year was probably the biggest test I've had because of long COVID. I couldn't run or train for nearly a year. So I lost my identity. I lost a big part of my coping mechanism. And it was probably the lowest, most difficult part of my life, because it was my biggest fear becoming a reality. I made it through, and I'm still here. And I think I've learned more resilience from that. So I'm still, whenever I get injured, I'm still in a bad place. A sprained ankle is luckily a very mild, easy fix. But I think the things I'm working on at the moment is more around that kind of self-acceptance, not getting stuck in this endless chasing the next thing, because I don't think that's going to lead to a very good place. But what has helped is creating something bigger. And, the charity for me is a big part of that, is being able to be able to focus on helping others. I think is really important, and it certainly helps me. But I don't want to give the illusion that I'm kind of fixed. I'm just better at managing it now.
I can totally relate to that. I know how long COVID is so tough. I think the thing with that is that I think a sprained ankle, will get better. You know what a sprained ankle is, and you know how it's going to, roughly how long it's going to take to get better. But long COVID is the big unknown, isn't it? No one really knows too much about it, or how it's going to impact individuals. Everyone seems to be affected slightly differently by it. So that must have been a scary time when you were facing that.
Yeah, I mean, I've only recently really made a comeback. I did the frog growing round a couple of weeks ago, which was my comeback project. But yeah, for so long, it was like the big unknown. Like, I didn't know whether I was ever going to get back to doing these things. And, that was an emotional moment to be running back in the hills again. And just to say it's back, I'm back. But as you say, there's no protocol, there's no timescale. And in January, to have a cardiologist saying to me, there's no reason why you can't try building back up, but you might never get back to where you were. I thought, sod that, I've got to find out.
That sounds like a challenge.
I think it's probably what I need to hear. Yeah.
So you are back running. What's the next? Have you got another big challenge lined up? Is there anything on the horizon?
Well, I was doing a little fell race last Sunday. It was an English Championship race, which is my first race since pre-COVID, actually. So I thought I'd ease myself back in with a 14-mile blast around the Howgills. So that was I think I'm not that interested in racing. I'm more interested in doing silly big things that haven't been done, because that's what raises more money, and that's what I think hopefully inspires people more. So I'm kind of at the moment trying to work out what I'm doing next. But what I can talk about is open water swimming has become my new thing, but running is still my main sport. I'm doing the 13 Valleys Ultra, which is a brand new event in September. That's 100k around the lakes. I've never raced 100k before. I've often been like a marathon kind of road runner, so that should be interesting. I'm still getting back to fitness. And then Aconcagua, which is the highest peak in South America. I'm going there in December for 3 weeks. And I didn't think I'd ever go back to high altitude, but I'm testing the water with a few plans. So that's what's coming up. but I am also scoping out a big project before I'm 30. So I'm thinking a bit differently, thinking bigger. But at the moment, it's just trying to get back to fitness and trying to think of something that hasn't been done.
Well, it's great. It's great to hear that you've got some exciting things in the pipeline. It sounds incredible. Some fairly hefty challenges in there. Now, for those of us who might not have quite such energetic ambitions, should we say, in terms of goals of future, what advice would you give to people who may be suffering with poor mental health themselves and looking for a challenge and wanting to do something? What would be your advice to them in terms of, taking on something that pushes you outside of your comfort zone? What would be the first step, and what would be the nugget of advice that you'd leave people with?
I think the first step would be, well, obviously taking the first step is always the hardest part, is set the date, like get it time bound. If there's been something you always wanted to do, but you've been putting off for various reasons, we all have reasons, is setting a date. With the Frog Graham, I literally just worked out when I was free in August and just committed and set the date, and I think as long as you will then work towards it. So I think firstly, setting a date, commitment is the difference to me. Otherwise, if you're waiting for the right moment, you'll never do it. Depending on, obviously, so sometimes the challenge is finding something that meets you where you are. And last summer, my challenge as such was swimming every day for 30 days in a row because of COVID. My body couldn't cope with more than that. So being realistic with yourself, not being too hard on yourself. Your goal could be, it might be just going for a walk half an hour every day. It might be getting out of the house. That is a win, and that's a win by your standards. Celebrate that and shout about that. Don't compare yourself. Because last year that was my challenge. It wasn't the hardest thing I'd done, but relative to where I was, it was a challenge. So yeah, I think it's setting a date, and then secondly, it's about finding the challenge that meets you where you are, and however small that may be, just start small and then raise the bar incrementally, is what I'd say. Things will go wrong. That's part of the adventure. It's an adventure, not a dress rehearsal.
Alex, thank you so much. You've spoken so much, fantastic advice to share with people there, and your story is a really powerful one. And listen, I wish you all the very best with everything you've got coming up and all your challenges. And I'd love to keep in touch and find out and keep track of what you're doing. And I imagine you're on social, and we can all follow you on there in terms of your adventures.
Sure, yeah. I'm always posting far too much on there. I'd love to hear from anybody as well. If anybody has any questions, or if I can help, if you've got a challenge idea, or just any advice in general, feel free to send me a message. Instagram is just my name. My website, alexstaniforth.com. You can find the various links and emails and books and all that on there. But yeah, please do feel free to connect and reach out to me.
Alex, all the best. Take care, and we'll catch up again soon.
Thank you, Tim.
That's it for this, the first ever episode of The Brave Front. Thanks to Alex Staniforth for sharing his incredible story with us and giving us all something to aim for, whether it's the Mount Everest in Nepal or an Everest of our own making. You'll find all the links to Alex's social pages and to Mind Over Mountains in the episode notes, where you'll also find our episode question, which this time around, and picking up on Alex's theme, is what is your personal Mount Everest? You can share your answer on the Spotify episode page, the link to which can be found in the episode notes or through our Linktree site in the Brave Front show profile. You can also leave us a voice message or even be a part of the show yourself. Again, check out our Linktree or the episode notes for all the details. And if you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe wherever you usually get your podcasts. In the meantime though, take care, and I'll see you soon.